Welcome back, everyone, to Cosmere 101. Today's session, the planets of the Cosmere. Before we dive into the planets themselves, take note of the symbol. Now, this symbol was on the opening of the first presentation. This is the symbol of the Cosmere as a whole. If anybody has had the opportunity to get a copy or borrow a copy of Arcanum Unbounded from your local library, you'll note this symbol on the book being held by the mysterious Arcanist on the cover. This symbol is the symbol of the Cosmere as a whole. Why do I bring that up? Because a number of the shard worlds, or planets, of the Cosmere have symbols that are associated with them either as ways to mark novels in the series set on these planets, or as ways to mark the web pages on the Coppermind website. For those of you unfamiliar, the Coppermind is a wiki created by the 17th Shard Group, a fantastic group of Brandon Sanderson fans who have developed a truly encyclopedic listing of the various bits of information on the Cosmere. This is a very brief, okay, I suppose it's not all that brief, it's about 20 planets long, but this is a brief overview of the various shard worlds or planets. Now, technically speaking, the term shard world refers to a world with a shard on it, or at least once had a shard on it. The various planets of the Cosmere have all been shaped by the power of Adonalsium and its shards. But the shards often invest themselves fully in one world. Or if you're autonomy, you try to branch out to a bunch of worlds. But that's a separate issue. We'll be talking about the shards later. But if a shard is in residence in a shard world, it's often referred to as a major shard world, while those without a shard present are sometimes referred to as a minor shard world. Now, if you have a shard present, there's a situation referred to as a perpendicularity. I mentioned this in our first video. This is a gateway between the physical and cognitive realms, and is usually a result of a shard's presence in a world collecting investiture in massive amounts, creating this puncture between the realms. However, especially in the case of worlds that autonomy claims through avatars, other perpendicularities can exist. But again, more on that a little later. For the sake of organization, we are going to go in appearance order in the published works of Brandon Sanderson. So Cell appears in the first published Cosmere novel, Elantris, in 2005, and in the novella Hope of Elantris the following year, which takes a look at the closing scenes of Elantris from the eyes of a young Elantrian child. The Emperor's Soul novella in 2012 is also set in this world, though on a different continent and nation. Elantris is going to be getting 2 sequels. Brandon has said he'll be writing those after the Mistborn Era 3 Ghostblood trilogy he's working on, and I wait for those very eagerly, personally. Now, the novellas can be found in the Arcanum Unbounded anthology I mentioned earlier. The symbol you see here is the Aeon or Aeonic character of Rao. This means spirit, and it looks to be 4 circles connected by lines to a central shape. This is the actual construction of the city of Elantris. If you look at the art of Elantris, and by the way, the art in that novel as well as the star map we see here are from Brandon's artistic team, in particular Isaac Stewart. Absolutely stunning work, by the way. And Elantris is shaped in this shape for a very specific reason. But more on that in the Invested Arts lesson. Now, the shards of Cell are devotion and dominion. It is very rare for a shard world to have more than 1 shard. This is a very big plot point, and we'll be digging into that when we get to the shards presentation. But both devotion and dominion were killed, as in their vessels were killed by Odium, and the power of the shards splintered and trapped in the cognitive realm around the planet of Cell. This became an intermingled mass of power called the Door. Now, the residents of Cell are frequently aware of the door. It features in several of the traditional belief systems of the world, and some of the cultures are very realmatically aware, that is to say, aware of the three parts of the Cosmere, and even aware that there is this energy, this door, clogging up the cognitive space. In fact, the door is effectively a plasma superstorm of power just roiling around Cell. The various invested arts are pressure valve releases, if you will, letting that trapped energy briefly escape into the physical world before it is then recycled back into itself. Now, while there are many different investitures in Cell, the systems are all basically one basic system. The nations with invested arts use the basic shape of their nation as the baseline for shaping and releasing the power of the door. Now, not every nation that we've come across has an invested art revealed, so maybe not all of them do have it, but the ones that do very closely rely on the shape of their nation to safely and accurately create these forms to release the door's power. And there's different ways to be initiated into these arts. Again, more on that in the invested arts topic next time, the next video. But Aeon Dor is the art of Aerolon, Cheishan is the art of Jindo, Dakor is the art of Fjorden, Forgery the art of Maipon, and Bloodsealing the art of Dtzmar. Now, the various cultures in Cell are the Aeonic culture, which is the prime culture of the nation of Aerolon, home of Aeon Dor, as well as its sister nation Teod across the water in the continent of the Rose Empire, although Teod is independent of the Rose Empire. Fjorden, or the Fjordell Empire, is centered around the nation of Fjorden and its art of Dakor, and one of the substates of Giant no longer has its own identity or culture. I would say that in the language of the Cosmere, connection to Gaiant no longer really exists because Gaiant is so enmeshed in Fjorden. However, other substates maintain their own identity, their own language, and so maybe they do have an invested art, but maybe they don't. Svorden is known for its university and its merchants. Hrovel, well, Hrovel actually has an invested art of sorts. It's not been named, but in the novel of Elantris, the Fjorden priest Hrathen makes use of an invested potion to make himself look like he's turned into an Elantrian. So maybe there is some way of preparing or brewing the elixirs in a particular shape of vessel or oven or kiln that allows the door's energy to invest them. We don't know. That was only a brief mention in the novel of Elantris, but hopefully in the sequels we'll find out a bit more about Dakor and about this possible invested potion situation. I'd also like a few more specific revelations about Aeon Dor, but that's me. And then we come to Hragan, which is a substate of the Fjorden Empire that is known for its chefs. And Jindo is the home of the Cheishan invested art. The Jindoese have a very strong sense of cultural identity and connection, even though they've been technically conquered by the Fjordell Empire. And people of Jindo descent can be found in both the subject state of Jador and the subject state of Duladel. Duladel is actually made up of people bearing both Aeonic and Jindo heritage, so we have definitely seen a person from Duladel becoming an Elantrian, a user of Aeon Dor, so I think that it's entirely possible for a Dula to also, or perhaps instead of becoming Elantrian, learn the art of Cheishan, and likely possible for people from Jador to do the same. The Rose Empire is on a continent to the north of Opelon. Opelon is the continent of Aerolon and the Fjordell Empire. The continent to the north is where Teod is and where the Rose Empire is. Now, the leading element of the Rose Empire is the Muladil, also called the Grand. And the Grands, they don't seem to have any invested art, but they seem to be perhaps a little more innately invested. So perhaps, in my opinion, there's something going on there where their land's invested art is more along the lines of being born or connected to this land grants you generally longer life, longer vitality, things like that. The subject nation of Ukurgi, also called the Strikers by residents of the Rose Empire. They also don't seem to have an invested art, but they seem to be taller and stronger than the other peoples of the empire, so perhaps the land itself seems to be granting its residents or its connected peoples certain physical enhancements. We also have My Pawn. My Pawn is the home place of the forgery art, and I find it interesting. Most of the invested arts of Cell fade in power the further away they get from their nation of origin. Even though Teod is an Aeonic culture nation, when Elantrians go to Teod in the novel, their powers are diminished. The Dakor using warrior monks of the feudal empire don't seem to have quite that problem, but that might be an issue for how they bring their forms of magic on their body rather than creating them in the moment. But again, speculation for the invested arts video. But the My Pawn forgery seems to function perfectly well all across the Rose Empire. Perhaps because of the connection between the empire as a unity and the individual nations, this is the case. So perhaps we will see that the other invested arts that are within or native to nations of the feudal empire, maybe they work fine everywhere in Fjordell, or maybe they only work well within their subnation. We'll find out. And My Pawn has been said to have some cultural or ethnic connections to Jindo. Then we come to the nation of Tsamar. Now, Tsamar is the most unique, in my opinion, of the substates of the Rose Empire that have been revealed. Its people, or at least the ones that we have seen, tend to be almost albino in appearance, and their art, much like the forgery art of My Pawn, focuses on making stamps that can then channel investiture for specific power, in this case, blood sealing. Now, the Celish system essay, if you will, in the Arcanum Unbounded, says that there are 3 great empires on this planet. Now, it could be that Chrysala, the author of these essays, it could be that she meant the Fjordell Empire on Opalan, the Rose Empire on the northern continent, and then perhaps Aerolan, because the Elantrians were a major power and force in the early days of Celish history. So maybe those are the 3 powers that she means. But maybe there is a 3rd great empire continent somewhere. Who knows? Again, I hope we will find out soon. All these cultures, by the way, are human cultures. But there are also the Seons and Skays of Cell. These are living, aware, sapient bits of investiture, splinters of devotion in the case of Seons, and of dominion in the case of the Skays. Now, the Seons, and presumably the Skays, can bond with people not dissimilar to a Nahel bond that we will see on Roshar. Again, these are all words we'll dive more into when we talk about the invested arts. But the Seons give their bonded partners the ability to use Seons like a communications network, speak from Seon to Seon. And presumably the particular Aeonic character at the heart of each Seon can be manifested in a burst of power. The Skays seem to have Fjordell characters in their center instead of Aeons. And by the way, I should describe the Seons and the Skays. They look like small floating balls of light in the case of the Seons, and small floating almost balls of pulsing darkness is a way I think of them in my head, but you can see pulsing in sort of a blacklight situation, the Fjordell character in the center. Both of these entities are able to speak. They have distinct personalities and even senses of humor, and their own beliefs. But it seems that the Skays are heavily influencing the Fjordell Empire and are integral to it behind the scenes, much as the Seons seem to be very common amongst the Aeonic peoples. Next we come to Nalthus. Now, this was the setting of the Warbreaker novel of 2009. So far, this is a standalone book, although there has been some talk of a sequel called Nightblood. Now, this novel and this world were created just before the first Stormlight novels, and one of the very intriguing and mysterious side characters of the Stormlight Archive is one of the main protagonists here in the Warbreaker novel, making this a prequel of sorts. Now, this is a world that has only a single shard, that of endowment, and the symbol that you find on the Coppermind for this world is a 5-pointed petal flower with blazing gold outside and deep purple inside. This has been confirmed by words of Brandon and interviews from the 17th Shard podcast as the Tear of Edgley. Edgley is the name of Endowment's vessel, and the Tears of Edgley are a very highly invested plant that grow near the shard pool of Nalthus. Now, as there is only a single shard on this planet, it seems to be pretty standard that for one shard you get one invested art. The more shards you get, the more interesting combinations or multiple arts that you can find there. But endowment, the shard of giving things or giving gifts, the shard of endowment endows every single Nalthian born on the planet with a breath, a bit of endowment's own investiture, a small splinter, if you will, of their investiture, and they're born with it. This makes them a little more vibrant. There's a play on words intended there. Maybe a slightly healthier, but given the nature of the shard, a Nalthian, or anyone that has a breath, a biochromatic breath to give its full title, can freely give away this breath to somebody else. If you store up a stockpile of breaths like this, the more breaths you get, the stronger your investiture pool is, and at a certain point, your aging slows so much you just stop aging completely. Now, you can use these breaths to invest them into inanimate objects with the proper command and have them, Sorcerer's Apprentice, animate. And you can retrieve those breaths later. It is very difficult for another Awakener, in fact, it's implied that it's almost impossible for another Awakener to retrieve the breath that another Awakener has used and written or programmed with a command. Now, there are massive numbers of human cultures on Nalthus. As far as we have seen so far, there are no other species on Nalthus, unless you want to count the Returned as a separate species, but the Returned are an interesting situation. The focus of Warbreaker is on the kingdom of Halandren, a theocracy ruled by the Returned. The Returned are the reanimated dead. Occasionally, Endowment will place a massive divine breath in the body of a recently deceased person, and always giving that person a choice about whether to come back. But if they come back with this massive divine breath, effectively replacing what is left of their departed spirit or enhancing what little of it remains at the moment of death, all the person's memories of their previous life are hidden, erased, maybe not fully erased because we do see one gradually regain some old memories, but that divine breath, if in effect, bolsters the fading soul of that person and gives them new life. If you're returned, you are functionally immortal. You can be killed, but you don't age, you don't get sick, but there is a catch. This divine breath has to be fueled, has to be fed. So the returned have to feed on breath every so often. Now, I'm going to be doing a separate video on some of the major species of the Cosmere, but that was just to explain to you briefly who the returned are. And they dominate this kingdom of Halandren. And Halandren is, in my belief, where we will find the shard pool of endowment, where the Tears of Edgley grow. The Return's presence there, now they appear elsewhere, but their strong concentration here indicates a big focus of power, which to my mind suggests a shard pool. Now, the kingdom of Idris follows a different religious tradition from the worship of the Returned, that is the religion of Halandren. The Idrians practice a religion called Austerism, which is a much more austere, if you'll pardon the pun, religious tradition focused on self-discipline, emotional control, but they do not get along with the Returned. In fact, they see the Returned and the Awakening art as evil. Now, the other main protagonist, uh, Vivenna, is going to be from the Kingdom of Idris, and she and the protagonist I mentioned earlier from both the Stormlight Archive novels and Warbreaker, he goes in Warbreaker by the name of Vasher. Although in Stormlight he is, and this is a minor spoiler, he is known as, again, spoiler, if you don't want to know this, skip ahead a couple of seconds. Vasher is known as Zahir on the planet of Roshar. Now, there is a brisk trade between Nalthis and other worlds. At least some people in Nalthis are aware of the Perpendicularity's ability to be used as a portal between realms, and monitor it, charge tariffs for commerce, and Endowment is aware of the people that come in and out of it. When the character of Hoyd sends her a letter, she scolds him for thinking he can sneak onto her world. I think that it is possible to hide from a shard when you enter through their perpendicularity, but probably very difficult. Now, Scadrial is the world that has had the most novels written for it. It is the setting of the Mistborn novels, that is to say, all of the Era 1 trilogy, all of the Era 2 quartet, and it will be the site for all of the Era 3 trilogy that is being written currently, and well, Series 4, likely it will have at least some portion of Series 4 set on it, but the nature of Series 4 indicates we might see other places besides Scadrial. More on that momentarily. Now, the novellas written, set in Scadrial, I should say, are The 11th Metal, published in 2011, Allomancer Jack, published in 2014, and Mistborn Secret History, published in 2016. And again, the 11th Metal and Allomancer Jack are more short stories. The Secret History, though, is definitely not a short story. It is a full novella, much like The Emperor's Soul. Now, like Cell, Scadrial drew the attention of two shards. To be perfectly blunt and honest, Scadrial was created by two shards. Most of the other shards did not create the worlds that they settled on. Those were already made by Adonalsium before the Shattering. But Preservation and Ruin made a bargain. They would combine their powers to create a whole new planet, and in fact, create humans from scratch there, using the original humans from the original world of humans as a template. Because of this, you will find a large number of humans on Scadrial that have innate investiture. The touch of preservation born in them and manifesting across the generations as a form of power, as allomancy. Now, the people of Scadrial have a bit of Ruin in them too, but Ruin's invested art is that of hemalurgy, which is not genetically inherited. It is a scholarly learned art. Anyone can use it if they know what they're doing and choose to do it. Or if Ruin himself decides to have it happen behind the scenes. Feruchemy is something of a balance art. It is a little bit of it is a little bit of preservation, a little bit of ruin. It is an art of harmony. And yes, that's another pun. Without giving big spoilers, I'll be giving more spoilers about this in the Shard video. Preservation and Ruin are, as of the end of the Era 1 trilogy, both held by a single holder. I will not tell you who that holder is in this video. I will talk about it in the Shard video. But the new holder, the new vessel, refers to themselves as Harmony because of the commingled and now joined shards. Now, that's going to cause some interesting issues for the new shard of Harmony, but needless to say, Feruchemy is in very big ways the invested art of Harmony, of both Preservation and Ruin. In Allomancy, Preservation's power is drawn out of the spiritual realm in bursts by using ingested metal as catalysts. In Feruchemy, metal worn on the body as a metal mind is used to store a personal trait, and then use that trait to boost whatever that trait is. Hemalurgy, you use a spike to steal a trait specific to the metal of the spike, from a donor. How you do that is literally bloody and will be talked about in more detail in the Invested Arts video. Now, Scadrial has a number of human cultures. In the northern continent, which was the main setting of the first trilogy, you had the noble and ska societies or ethnicities, as well as the terrace people. From Era 2 onwards, the changes of the planet, you'll note in the star map, again, big shout out to Isaac Stewart for this beautiful artwork. The old orbit of the old calendar, this is the Era 1 orbit. At the end of Era 1, Scadrial just is going to move orbit. How that happens, you have to read the book or listen to the Shard episode. But as of Era 2 onward, the Ska and noble populations of the northern continent have intermingled and married, so now there's no longer a separate Ska or noble ethnicity. They're just one group now. But you do have different cultures depending on whether they live in the Elendil Basin or in the more Wild West style roughs. The Terracemen have maintained a separate cultural and ethnic identity. And the Khandra, the immortal shapeshifters from Era 1, are still very much around in Era 2. They have their own society, although they do blend in and hide amongst the human cultures. The Koloss, who were hemalurgic slave soldiers, are now a free and independent species, although both the Koloss and the Khandra have links to humanity in their distant past. In the southern continent, you have the great masked nations. These days, they are under the united leadership of the Malwish, but you have the Hunters, you have the Malwish, you have the Lost Ones, and you have several other groups that have not been fully named yet. But each of these 5 societies wear masks as part of their culture, although the specific culture details what kind of mask and when and how you wear it and what that mask represents. The Hunters, for example, literally wear masks pressed into their skin so that the skin eventually grows over the mask. It becomes a part of their face. Whereas the Malwish, they will change masks based on profession or based on mood, even raising their mask as a show of trust, respect, or familiarity. But again, we'll talk a bit more in detail about this later on. Before we leave this, however, take note of the symbol here. The allomantic metals, the 16 metals that can be used for allomancy or for alchemy, they have symbols in curved lines and spikes, just as they have in right angles and spikes in Feruchemy. The symbol you're looking at here is the symbol of harmony, the joined nature of preservation and ruin in one. There were just too many Mistborn novels to list in the previous scene, so here's a basic rundown. Again, in order of publication, the Era 1 novels are Mistborn, sometimes called Mistborn the Final Empire or the Final Empire, followed by the Well of Ascension and the Hero of Ages. This is the story of Scadrial under the domination of the immortal Lord Ruler, a god king who rules with a great tyrannical bent and immense power. This is the struggle of rebels to overthrow the Lord Ruler, and then what happens when the figure that's been holding society together, even as a tyrant, is deposed? What is the aftermath of that, and why the heck are the ash mounts, those big volcanic mountains that provide the ash cloud that shield the residents from the heat of the sun, why are those volcanoes going crazy? Why are the Koloss going crazy? And what the heck are these voices talking into people's ears? Again, more on that if you read the books, or if you listen to my Shard episode later on down the line, or my deep dives into some of the novels that I'm hoping to do later on. Era 2 takes place after everything from Era 1 has settled down, and the world has literally been reshaped and moved to a new orbit. Era 2 is a Weird West steampunk style of story with people with revolver firearms, with steam-powered locomotives, early stage electric lights and radio technology, but still with the powers of allomancy and Feruchemy. And in fact, in Era 2, due to mixed marriages between the terrace and the other residences of the northern continent. You have some people that are twin-born, that have a single power of allomancy and a single power of feruchemy. But you no longer see the full mistborn or the full feruchemist in the world. This is also when we introduce the southern continent and the masked nations, and we are going to be coming up to the Era 3 novels. By the way, Era 2 was also very much a mystery style of story, with each novel having a mystery that the main characters of Wax, Wayne, and Marasi, and later on Steris would solve. And of course, we cannot forget Milan. That was the Alloy of Law in 2011, The Shadows of Self in 2015, The Bands of Mourning in 2016, and The Lost Metal in 2022. The Ghostbloods trilogy, which will begin with a novel called Ghostbloods, and its two sequels will be set some nearly a century in the future from the Era 2 novels, and it will be in a very Cold War 1980s era style of society in the Basin. This is going to be, I think, probably a lot of spy and intrigue thrillers, both between the Elendil Basin and the Malwish, and possibly with the Ghostbloods trying to, as independent agents, navigate a way for Scadrial to be safe even from itself. The Ghostbloods, who are they, you may ask? We'll get to them. They're interesting. And to talk about the Ghostbloods will involve some spoilers from Era 1, Era 2, and Stormlight, but more on that later. Era 4 has been said by Words of Brandon to be a space opera-style trilogy. We've already seen in the Isles of the Emberdark, more on that later on, that the various worlds of the Cosmere will learn how to mechanize their invested arts for the purpose of traveling both through physical space with faster than light travel and traveling at a slower physical speed through the cognitive realm, using the condensed pockets of space between the cognitive realms of planets to rapidly transport between worlds. Now, because this is a space opera style of trilogy, which will have Hoyt as a main character, I've talked about Hoyt several times now, I'm going to do a separate episode on him because he needs his own episode. He deserves his own episode. He's been through a lot. But given that this is a space opera style trilogy, I think this is going to be the novels in which we will see space traveling allomancers and feruchemists and Hoyd going to different worlds. Possibly worlds we've already seen, possibly seeing worlds that are only mentioned in passing for the first time. But again, we'll see what happens. Then we come to Roshar, the setting of the Stormlight Archives, and the novella Edge Dancer from 2016, published also in the Arcanum Unbounded anthology, and taking place in the midst of the second novel of the Stormlight Archive, Words of Radiance. Dawnshard, a novella written in 2020 after the publication of the anthology, that takes place in between Oathbringer and Rhythm of War. And there has been promise of a Horn-Eater novella, that's the title, focusing on the character of Rock, taking place in the aftermath of Rhythm of War. The Lopen short story has been published on the back of several collectible cards that were revealed at a recent Brandon Sanderson Cosmere convention event, the Dragonsteel Nexus. And another short story called Edge Dancer, focusing on a near-death escape of one character named Yasna, more on her later, as she navigates the cognitive realm to find her way back to the physical one after the events of, again, the second novel of the Stormlight Archive, Words of Radiance. And likely we'll get a few more novellas in between the Stormlight books. The Stormlight books are massive in terms of page count and size and number of characters. So novellas and short stories are good ways for Brandon to flesh out a few things, reveal a couple of things to set up the next novels, or to help the big Cosmere nerd fans like myself dig a little deeper and find out some hidden gems, yes, that's an intentional pun, about the world. Now, like Scadrial and Sel, Roshar has multiple shards, specifically honor and cultivation. These two shards settled on Roshar. They found it and found that it was Well, quite frankly, designed by Adonalcium to be a planet of math. Math is very important in the cognitive realm and mysticism of Roshar. And honor and cultivation adopt the planet and the planet's native inhabitants. In fact, they start to resonate with the rhythms of the planet. Now, again, more on why I'm emphasizing the word rhythms in our invested arts video, but that has importance here. Now, Odium ends up, after butchering devotion and dominion and killing ambition, Odium settles on a neighboring planet called Ashen. And Odium starts investing a bit in Roshar as well, but is locked away. More on that in just a second here. But the Vessel of Honor is killed by Odium. But Odium ends up getting trapped on a nearby planet. Odium's influence can be felt on Roshar at certain times and circumstances during the devastations. Sorry, the desolations, not the devastations. That's my bad. I'm tired. But during desolations, Odium's investiture and influence is visibly felt in Roshar. But outside of those times, it is honor and cultivation's influence that are most heavily felt. And we can see this in the surge binding investiture. Strictly speaking, there's several different types of surge binding. But the most common, the most widespread, this is the combination of honor and cultivation together. Cultivation and honor are both seen in the way you gain the power through swearing oaths that are progressively helping you grow, spiritually speaking. And these oaths allow you to breathe in Stormlight, the investiture of honor, although we do see at least one current day Knight Radiant that can use Lifelight, the investiture of cultivation, and given some things we see about some of the bondsmiths, again more on them later, likely at least one bondsmith can make and use Lifelight. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Sorry. Nerding out. So sorry. Now, recent events, again this is a little spoiler here, recent events have changed things in Roshar massively in terms of both the investiture situation and the invested art situation, but there is still a free splinter of honor and a brand new oath pact. What is that? Well, as Brandon says, read and find out, or listen and find out in later videos. The investiture of surge binding through honor and cultivation is still protected by this new oath pact, and all the Nahel Spren, all of the living splinters of sentient investiture that are a combination of honor and cultivation, they are still free and still able to make these Nahel bonds surge binding. There is something called the Old Magic on Roshar, and this is cultivation using investiture to grant boons and curses. This is a very nebulous style of magic. It does not conform to the number 10 the way surge binding does, or the number 16 the way the metallic arts do. But it does seem to have big impact and has major narrative impact across the first 5 books of the Stormlight Archives. Now, humans immigrate to Roshar and are currently the largest species present on the planet in terms of number, and they include, in terms of big cultural identities, the Makabaki peoples, the Shin people, the various Vorin cultures like the Alethi and the Carbranthi, and the Vadens, and the Thalens, although the Thalens also have a little passions things going on there. And you could even say the Natans, the people of New Natan, they practice Vorinism and are part of the Vorin culture. And then you have the Horn Eaters, who are very different because of their proximity to cultivation's perpendicularity, in my opinion. And then you have the original inhabitants, the listeners, humanoids with the capacity to make very different kinds of bonds with non-sapient spren to take different forms. And then you have the Amiens. Now, technically speaking, you have 2 peoples on Roshar called the Amiens, but one prefers to be called the Sleepless, and so I'm just using Amien to mean the mysterious blue-skinned peoples that are connected to the humans of Natan and Baden with the blue skin or blue veins. But the Amiens seem to be partially of the cognitive realm. Again, more on them when we do a species video later on. And the sleepless are immortals, much like the Amiens and the Kandra, but in a very different way because they're living collectives of insects, crustaceans, and arachnids. And with that nightmare fuel in your mind, I mentioned the Nahel Spren. The Nahel Spren are 10 varieties, technically 9 major species, and then the 10th is more of 3 unique, distinct spren. But the Nahel Spren were created by Honor and Cultivation, their children, effectively. Although the Honor Spren are mostly, if not entirely, of Honor, and the Cultivation Spren are mostly, if not entirely, of Cultivation. And these Spren are sapient. They have language, they have culture. Several of them have formed their own city-states in Shadesmar, in the cognitive realm of Roshar. Some have built their own armies and empires. They're people. They have their own cultures. And the symbol of Roshar, this is a symbol of the Knights Radiant, of Surge Binding. It shows 10 points. It's sometimes called the Almighty's Eye. It shows 10 points made out of the honor blades, the honor-only swords that the heralds, again, more on them later, use to surge bind without oaths. Ironically, it is surge binding purely of honor, but without oaths. It's an interesting situation there. But there are 10 types of Nahel Spren, therefore 10 types of Nahel Bond, and 10 different surges. And again, shout out to Isaac Stewart for the star map over here. And given the prominence of 10, yes, you guessed it, there are 10 planets in the Rosharan system. Roshar is the second of these. The first 3 planets in the system closest to the Sun are the 3 main invested planets of the system. And these are the novels of the Stormlight Archives. The first arc, books 1 through 10, have been published, and already I've read them. I've read just about all the Cosmere novels to date these days. The Stormlight Archives are epic. It is truly Brandon Sanderson's epic fantasy magnum opus. Now, the Cosmere novels, you don't have to have read any other Cosmere novel or series to enjoy any other Cosmere series. You can read Mistborn Era 1 and Era 2 without actually having read any other Cosmere things. There are things in particular at the end of Era 2 in the Lost Metal that are spoilers or Easter eggs for other Cosmere worlds, and throughout Stormlight there are epigraphs that give hints at greater lore of the Cosmere and places in the Cosmere, people in the Cosmere. But it's perfectly acceptable and possible to read Mistborn Era 1 and or Era 2 without reading anything else, to read Elantris without reading anything else, to read Warbreaker without reading anything else. But Stormlight is going to have the most connections, and that's an investiture pun, to other worlds from the beginning, given the sheer number of world hoppers or travelers from other worlds that make cameo appearances or big appearances in the Stormlight Archives. Each of the 10 novels is going to be focused on a different order of Knights Radiant and will have a main character that will be a flashback person to fill in the backstory of not just those characters, but the events of the world and the story. So far, we've had Way of Kings in 2010, focusing on the Windrunners and Kaladin. You might call Kaladin a paladin, but Kaladin is the Windrunner character and the big focus of the Way of Kings, and he's, quite frankly, a main character focus throughout the first 5 books. Words of Radiance in 2014 focuses on Shallan and her Lightweaver order, and she, like Kaladin, is also a main point of view character throughout the first 5 books. Oathbringer in 2016 is the midpoint and focuses on Dalinar. Dalinar is the bondsmith focus character, although not the only one, as we will discover later. And his story is going to be fleshed out in a big way here. And again, he is also a main vocal character and point of view character throughout. Rhythm of War is going to focus on the listeners, in particular the listener Eshonai and the listener Venli, and the Will Shaper order of knights that Venli does end up joining. This book also creates a massive amount of lore speculation and lore reveals. But I don't think any Stormlight book has had as much lore reveal as Wind and Truth, published in 2024. This focuses on Szeth and the Skybreaker Order, although not quite as much in terms of focusing on a given order as the orders we've seen previously. The Skybreakers actually get a big reveal and talk about in the narrative of Oathbringer, but we do see a bit more inside look at what the relationship between the Skybreakers and their Spren are in Wind and Truth. We see a lot more about the Shin people that Szeth was born into in Wind and Truth, and of course, we found out a lot more about Szeth. Things also really get shaken up in Arc 1. Again, spoilers in a later video. Arc 2 will deal with the aftermath of Arc 1, and we'll take a look at the Edge Dancers and the signature Edge Dancer character of Lift, introduced in Arc 1, and in the interludes of Arc 1, and in the novella Edge Dancer, but she's going to be a big point of view character now. Reynaren, who is I would call him a major side character in Arc 1. He's going to become a major point of view character. He is a truth watcher, more or less. Spoilers later. And the Herald Shalash and the Herald Taln will each have a book, and Shalash, I believe, is going to become the signature Dustbringer protagonist of the series, while Taln is going to be the signature Stoneward character of the series. This is speculation on my part, but there's a lot of hints and symmetry in the novel's writings that I think will prove this out. And again, I'll talk more about that in later videos. And then Yasna, the title character of the Edge Dancer short story, she's been a major element of the Stormlight Archive Art 1 throughout. She's been a main character, but like her cousin Reynaren, not a main point of view character. She will be a big point of view character and leader all through Arc 2, and she will be the culmination, her and her Elsecaller order. And we come to the last two planets of the Rosharan system. They are both mentioned and even seen in the Stormlight archives, at least in the first 5 books. There has been talk of a novella set in Ashen called The Silence Divine, but that is not on the docket just yet. Brandon is focusing right now on completing and, well, writing Mistborn Era 3, and then the Elantris sequels, and then diving back into Stormlight Book 6, focusing on Lift and the Edge Dancers. Now, Braze has been the prison of Odium and his servants, the Voidbringers, the Fused, although other people have been called Voidbringers, more on that in spoilers later. But Odium got trapped on Braze by the Oath Pact. Honor and Cultivation effectively tricked him. The vessel of Odium, a human named Race, figured he could play fast and loose with his word, while making a deal with the Shard of Honor. I think he had a big ego issue there that blinded him to that certain possibility. But Odium was trapped on Braze. Now, Braze, like Roshar, like Ashen, these all existed before the Shattering. Something's going on with Braze. One of the reasons why Odium and the fused cognitive shadows could be trapped there was because there's something at the core of the planet that acts like a spirit magnet, a soul magnet. It's strange, and I am loving the mystery. I want to know what's going on there. But basically, Odium and the Fused, who are his big invested cognitive shadow servants that possess the bodies of the living when they return to Roshar, they're trapped on Braze, with the Heralds of Honor acting as warden and tormented fellow prisoner. If any herald breaks down while on Braze and goes back to Roshar, it opens the floodgates, and all the trapped souls, all the trapped fused can go back too. Now, Odium is referred to in the Ars Arcanum of Stormlight as being the patron of void binding. We've seen surge binding, a lot of surge binding. Surge binding through the combined oaths of honor and cultivation and the Nahel bond, surge binding through the honor blades alone, and surge binding through the fused, the 9 brands of the fused. Odium's really big in the number 9, as opposed to 10. And the fused use surges, but they fuel it with void light, with Odium's power. So I've heard some fan speculation that void binding is the fused using void light to surge bind, but there's also the different regal forms of power. I mentioned before that the singers can take on different forms. Well, if they bond with a spren of Odium, they can take on Odium-fueled forms that have special powers, including precognitive ability. Now remember, the shards can't actually see the future specifically, they see possible futures and thus are able to gauge the likely or most possible outcome. Some of the, at least one of the regal forms of the listeners seems to have that same ability based on the songs of the listeners, the songs of forms shown in the Rhythm of War. Now, there are no cultures on Braze. It's a prison planet. Only the sentient, very angry spren of Odium and the very angry cognitive shadows of the fused singers live on Braze full time, if at all. Now, in Ashen, humans immigrated to Roshar from Ashen. How humans got to Ashen, not quite sure. That's not been said just yet. Although Isles of the Emberdark has proven that navigation through the cognitive realm has been going on for a very long time. But likely the humans from Ashen came from Yolen. More on Yolen later. The humans here ended up worshipping Odium when Odium invested in the place and gave them surge binding with no limits. Now, Honor, suspicious of Odium, decided to... He still invested in Roshar, but he took a little bit of a field trip to Ashen and invested part of himself there to also give some surge binding, to also try and fight Honor there, where Roshar would not be directly impacted. Well, it turns out if you give unrestricted surge binding to humans and let two shards duke it out, even through that kind of proxy, you literally end up with the humans accidentally igniting the air on Ashen, turning it into a blasted wasteland. Now, the humans who would become heralds, at least some of them, will end up using the surges to Elscall, to transport massive numbers of humans from their dying world of Ashen to Roshar. And what happens after that? Well, read Rhythm of War, read Wind and Truth, read the whole Stormlight Archives. That's going to be where that comes into play, but I will give a little bit more spoilers later on. Now, not everyone escaped from Ashen. Some humans stayed. The residual investiture from Odium's time there infused the microbes of the planet, the germs. And on the various floating cities that float above the shattered core, molten core of the planet, there are people called incubators. Now, how do we know this? Even though Silence Divine has not been published, Brandon has read several, one or two chapters from his early drafts, and here we see the incubators, people who intentionally let themselves become infected, and depending on the disease you're infected with, you might have powers. But only so long as the infection remains. If your immune system kicks in and kills the invested bacteria, you lose the powers, although echoes can remain of past investiture. This brings us to Taldane, the world of the White Sands graphic novel compilation. The graphic novel is a 3-part graphic novel that is now available in an omnibus form. And the omnibus form, which has all 3 together, by the way, includes some absolutely stunning art from the folks at Dynamite Comics, including not just an Ars Arcanum, but an Ars Arcanum in the form of artistic sketches of Sand Mastery and even some of the star marks, written by Chris. Now, this world is the homeworld of Chrysala, or Chris, the author of all the Ars Arcanum, and she is a main character in the novel, one of the 2 protagonists. Now, this world was settled by autonomy. And autonomy is an odd shard because it is constantly trying to claim other worlds, or rather, making avatars in other worlds using her powers. Now, unlike most worlds with 1 shard, at least unlike Nalthis that has 1 shard, there are 2 different forms of investiture on Taldane. Sand Mastery on the day side, I should mention here, half the planet is constantly in daylight from the larger blue-white sun. The other half of the planet is constantly in a state of twilight or darkness, being lit by the filtered UV rays of a dwarf star surrounded by a particulate ring. Caught between these 2 stars, Taldane is tidally locked. It's pretty much caught in place. It doesn't rotate. The further you get to the equator, or the center part, the darker it gets if you're on day side, or the lighter it gets if you're on dark side. On the day side, there is an invested art called Sand Mastery. Now, there seems to be a big amount of, how would I put this? It seems that autonomy is plagiarizing other shards' investiture systems in a big way in her various worlds. Sand Mastery uses something very similar to the Luhal bond of the Aethers, more on that later, to let Sandmasters give up some of their internal water supply to telekinetically control sand, making a temporary bond with it. The star marks of the dark side are effectively invested tattoos or body markings. It's not said whether these are given or born with, although I think honestly probably born with. Although you never know. It's hard to say. Autonomy's investitures tend to have very big proving yourself vibes to their initiation, tests, trials, surviving something. So we really don't know where the star marks come from in terms of, are you born with them? Are they given to you? Do they just appear at some point? But what is known from the Omnibus Ars Arcanum is that pulses of investiture will come from the particulate ring around that smaller sun and invest the star marks on dark side. The star marks act as effectively a capacitor storing this energy. This, to me, feels very similar to how surge binders on Roshar inhale and hold investiture for later use. Just like Sand Mastery reminds me an awful lot of what's going on with the Aether Bond. Now, on the dark side, you have a single dynasty, an empire that controls all the other nations of that side of the planet. Now, it tends to have a lot of Enlightenment, that is to say, 17 to early 1800s era styles of technology. Taldane already has firearms, while every other planet in the Cosmere at the time of the White Sand novels is still using bows and arrows, or at best crossbows, for their ranged projectile weapons. It's considered one of the more technologically advanced worlds, in part because it seems that autonomy is intentionally pushing the technological advancement, giving technology to the people that she feels are showing the most survival of the fittest instinct and traits. On Dayside, you see a variety of cultures adapted to desert life. The Kretza are one very prominent, widespread desert culture, and they worship an avatar of autonomy called the Sand Lord. And the nation of Lawsand, which is the home of the Sand Masters, Lawsand does have green growing river-fed areas, but still has a lot of desert areas, especially given how Sand Masters, use sand. And while you do see an avatar on the day side, there's hints of an avatar on the dark side. The immortal emperor of the dynasty has very powerful star marks and seems to me like he might be an avatar of autonomy in a different way from the Sand Lord. In the graphic novels, we do see the Sand Lord influencing something, and we do hear the immortal ruler of the dynasty being talked about as having survived numerous assassination attempts and having used powers beyond what people have ever seen to dominate the minds of others. Both of those things scream avatar of autonomy to me. But that's just me. We will see other avatars of autonomy in different books, and again, I will spoil that in other videos. Threnody has not yet had a novel written about it, but the short story, or rather the novella, because it's sizable and beautifully written, the novella Shadows for Silence in the Forest of Hell was published in 2013 and is in the Arcanum Unbounded anthology, as is this beautiful star chart of the Threnodite system. You'll notice most of the other star charts we've seen, the main world is the only one in there, or the only inhabited one in there. Scadrial, there is no other inhabited world in the Scadrian system. There's no other inhabited world in the Celish system. In the Rosharan system, you have 3 inhabited worlds, but they're all 3 close to the sun. Threnody is one of 3 inhabited worlds, and each of them has a name associated with, funerals. Threnody is a sort of dirge for the dead. Now, There is talk of a standalone novel called The Night Brigade, and that title refers to a particular group of mercenaries that feature in the Sunlit Man novel, but hasn't been written yet. He's got a lot of work, our Brandon, in writing the rest of the Mistborn and Stormlight situations he's got going, plus the Elantris sequel, so we'll see when Night Brigade is written. I would love to see it personally because this world is fascinating and terrifying. There is no shard on Threnody, but Odium killed and splintered the shard of ambition, leaving a very large splinter of ambition here and leaving a huge wound in the cognitive realm called the knell, or the disturbance. Now, other splinters of ambition end up stripped of their intent and just slithering around the Emberdark, the space between planet cognitive realms in the cognitive realm, and they're terrifying. They consume souls, they are constantly greedy for life and the living, and it seems like a lot of Ambition's investiture ended up stuck in Threnody, because there is a perpendicularity here despite there not being a shard. But the perpendicularity is described as being very disturbing and not terribly stable. So my guess is the perpendicularity to get to or from Threnody has to do with death, or the massive splinter of ambition called the evil. The big form of investiture we see here are the invested souls of Threnodites. And even Threnodites that leave the planet for generations later seem to still have this strongly ambition-invested soul, so that when they die, they don't always, but they can frequently become shades. The big investiture in their souls keeps the soul from passing on, and instead they linger. Now, the shades we see in Shadows for Silence are largely animalistic or instinct-driven. You break one of the rules, they go nuts, and their glowing green eyes turn a flaming red, and they start consuming you. And being consumed by a shade can turn a Threnodite into a shade sometimes. Again, it's not all that clear. There's still a lot of mysteries here. But we do see at least one shade in this novella that seems to recognize living relatives and calm down a little bit. And in Isles for the Emberdark, there's a shade as a main speaking, thinking character. More on that later. But yeah, it's fascinating. And everyone's scared of the shades. In Mistborn Secret Histories, there's an entire pocket of the Elantrians called the Eyrie, and they have anti-Threnodite shade defenses up because they're terrified of the shades leaving the Threnodite cognitive realm and feeding on people. Now, cultures, this is a human-only world, so far as we know. You have the societies of the Forerunners, or settlers that live in the forests of hell, and then you have the city dwellers. Both of these societies coexist on a smaller continent. The homeland continent, which was larger, it is currently overrun by the mysterious evil. That's the name given to the large splinter of ambition. First of the Sun is interesting because it had its first novella published in 2014, Sixth of the Dusk. This is in the Ars, sorry, not the Ars, but the Arcanum Unbounded anthology. But its first full novel was published this very year in 2025. Isles of the Emberdark incorporates a lot of the Sixth of the Dusk novella as flashback chapters in the opening sequences. There is no shard presently on First of the Sun, but it is claimed by autonomy. An avatar there in the form of the Isle of Pachi is sentient, is aware, can communicate. Pachi communicates with Hoid via letter in the epigraphs, I should say, of the Stormlight Archives once, and does communicate with Sixth of the Dusk, the title character of the novella. Now, the investiture here is interesting. The AVRs are birds who, when they eat highly invested parasite worms in Autonomy's shard pool on the Isle of Pachi, they gain invested powers for life. Now, those powers do not transmit to their descendants. If the next generation of birds wants these powers, they got to eat the worms. So it's interesting. This is this shows that investiture can either be inherited genetically, as we see over in Scadrial, or an invested person, their personal soul and spirit web might be changed, but that doesn't necessarily pass down to their descendants fully or at all. Now, these birds have use of their powers on their own, but they can form a Nahel bond, or at least that's how it's described by the Cosmere aware world hoppers in Isles of the Emberdark. They are able to form a bond without the oaths required by Nahel Spren. And the human who bonds an AVR, and you can bond multiple AVR, which does seem to indicate you could, in theory, bond multiple Spren, but we'll get to that in the investiture and invested arts chapter. I'm already over time as it is. But the AVRs can choose to bond with a human and grant the human their powers, or let the human benefit from their powers at least. Now, so far as we know, while there are some sleepless watching this place, the main cultures and inhabitants are all humans. You have people who live on the mainland islands, who tend to be more urban, more technologically advanced, but then you have the peoples who still live on the islands, and they're a hunter-trapper society. If they live on the outer edges of the Pantheon Islands, they're not necessarily given the title of trapper, but if they survive but if those who feel the calling survive the training of the invested animals and highly poisonous and deadly creatures on the Pantheon Islands, then they often will have the title of trapper and live fairly solitary lives, raising the AVRs on these islands to then share the AVR with their societies, to sell them to their fellow members of the islanders, or occasionally to the mainlanders. Now, the human societies of First of the Sun dramatically and rapidly advance in technology during the course of Sixth of the Dusk and Isles of the Emberdark, due to some world hoppers from various worlds, notably Scadrial and Roshar, trying to interfere and influence and claim the planet. Now, this is going to be a very interesting world, I think. And yes, that phrase, I think, is a little shout out to the character of Zazid from the Mistborn series. But Isles of the Emberdark revealed a very fascinating possibility for the humans of this world to be directly invested, but we'll see how that turns out. During the course of the COVID pandemic, Brandon Sanderson ended up writing a series of secret novels, most of which were in the Cosmere, one of which was not. But the Cosmere secret novels each showed a brand new world. Now, The Isles of the Emberdark was revealed to be a hidden fifth secret novel that he was doing during the course of this time. But the Tress of the Emerald Sea novel, published in 2023, shows us the world of Lumar. Now, this world has no shard, as far as we know, has no perpendicularity, but there is an Aether variant here. Instead of the usual prime Aethers from the planet of Datri, more on them later, the 12 stationary moons, now stationary from the perspective of the planet, if the planet turns, the moons just constantly stay floating over wherever they're supposed to float. These moons drop pollen Aether, filling up the empty space where other planets might have oceans with these pollen seas. Now, the corrupt parasitic prime Aethers on these moons use that pollen to drain water from the world parasitically. This is an incomplete Luhel bond, you might say. The Luhel bond is how the Aether magic works. Now, this planet is entirely human in population. There is a talk of the Iriali on this planet, just as there is evidence in Isles of the Emberdark that the Iriali settled the First of the Sun planet. Now, in the Stormlight Archives, the Iriali talk about the journeys that they make to the next worlds, and they talk about 10th worlds. I'll probably try to do a separate video on the Iriali just to dive through that lore. But at any rate, The humans here have learned to not cry or get water anywhere near the spore seas because if they do, the spores erupt. Each type of pollen spore, depending on the color or aether, releases something different when they get wet. Now, there are human kingdoms on islands in these pollen seas. It seems that each of the 12 seas has a kingdom except for the Midnight Sea that has no nation. It's just too blasted dangerous there. There is one resident of that sea during the course of the novel Tressa of the Emerald Sea, that is the Sorceress. And the Crimson Sea, again, no nations, no kingdoms. It is way too dangerous there. Why those two are so dangerous we'll talk about in the Invested Arts video. But there is a dragon named Sysis or Foil who has a residence underneath the Crimson Sea. And he's also a figure in the Isles of the Emberdark novel. Canticle is found in the Sunlit Man novel, also in 2023. This is the second of the secret novels that Brandon wrote. Again, no shard here, and much like Braze and Roshar, the world of Canticle seems to have been built with a specific design by Adonalsium. The sun here is heavily invested, and moves around, and as the sunlight hits the world, it's so hot it burns everything to a crisp, but the earlier, gentler rays of the sun are so highly invested it causes rapid plant growth, just like the surge of progression does. And if a living being, because all souls are investiture after a fashion, if a living being is burned up by the sunlight, they turn into a cinder stone, a highly condensed nugget of investiture that can be used to power the floating cities and sky cycle hovercraft of the Threnodite descendant humans that make this planet their home. These mobile cities are constantly on the move because if you stay in one place, the sun's going to burn you alive. Although they do have a cultural legend about safe underground places. But given how hot the sunlight gets, the landscape here is constantly getting changed. Not just the flora and the fauna having to constantly be on the move or constantly grow and regrow, but the mountains, the physical landscape is constantly getting melted like wax and reshaped because as soon as that super hot sun goes away, the then rapidly cooling air creates storm systems that help water the newly invested, rapidly growing plants. It's a constantly changing landscape. Now, the worlds of Komashi and Utol are seen in Yumi and the Nightmare Painter. Now, there's going to be a bit of spoiler situation going on here, not full spoilers, but a little bit. Utol is seen through telescopes, and there's even a hint at the end of The Sunlit Man that Nomad, who that is, you'll have to find out by reading the book, ends up effectively teleporting here based on the description of a largely ocean world. Utol is described in Yumi the Nightmare Painter as being largely ocean with islands. And we know from the description of people living there from the telescopes and the exploration that the Komashi are doing that the people living in Utol are Shodel, a Fane life species native to Yolen, who are humanoid but with extra arms. And that seems to match the description we see at the end of Sunlit Man. But Utol and Komashi are sister planets. The large black shroud that covers Komashi and prevents any starlight or day or sunlight from ever getting in doesn't prevent light from Utol getting in. They can see Utol from Komashi. That's how they are able to use their telescopes there and even develop spaceships to go there. Virtuosity is one of the few shards we know of that was not splintered by Odium, but actually splintered herself. Now, why she did this, we don't know. Hoyd just says in the novel Yumi and the Nightmare Painter that Virtuosity splintered herself between these planets. But a huge amount of her investiture landed in Komashi and possibly in Utol. In Komashi, we see the Hiones, the splinters of virtuosity that can be spoken to by the Hijo or the Yoki Hijo, and the Hiones are attracted by the creation of art, appropriate given that virtuosity is the intent of creating art. Once they have been drawn to the act of art creation, the Yoki Hijo, who are highly invested artists that can act as spirit shamans here, request that the Heons shape themselves into useful items that can mimic the invested abilities of other places, such as mimicking anti-gravity powers from Roshar, or or mimicking just creating light, much like light weaving from various worlds. But the Yokihijo are specific to the Tori nation of humans. And the Tori nation and the Nagadan nation, both human nations, very different levels of technology. The Nagadans use Heon lines to power late 20th century eras of technology, and they even have a great step forward in technology, instant noodles. Yes, I'm a huge fan of instant noodles, as is Hoid. And throughout the novel, there is speculation that the Nagadans are actually on Utol. Spoiler, they are not. But I don't want to spoil too much more than that. But it's a fascinating world as we see how virtuosity splinters interact with the creativity and arts of the people on this planet, and as we see some of the dark history revealed and the origin of the Shroud revealed. But again, too many spoilers there. We'll move on. Oberdai and Vax have never been seen in the novels, as far as we know. They've only been mentioned. Oberdai is mentioned in the epigraph letters from Pachi to Hoid, in which the avatar of autonomy, that is Pachi, warns Hoid to not go to Oberdai again, saying that a new avatar of our being, a new avatar of autonomy is being created there, referred to as a she, and that she is being instilled with a great instinctive dislike of Hoid, so don't go back there, Hoid. But we know nothing else about Oberdai. We know that autonomy's claimed it, so there's an avatar forming there as of Arc 1 of Stormlight. Presumably, much like we see on First of the Sun, autonomy's claim has allowed a perpendicularity to appear. Presumably, there is some form of investiture there in which autonomy, much as we've seen her do in Taldane and First of the Sun, there's likely some form of investiture that involves the local ecology and survival, showing your will to survive, to be self-sufficient, and likely cultures, because there's likely people there, or autonomy wouldn't be terribly interested in it. But we don't know much else about it. Vax is only ever mentioned in the Mistborn Secret History novella and in one of the Ars Arcanum of Chris. Specifically the Elantris Ars Arcanum, in which she says the Elantrians are initiated into their art in a way that is different from Vax or anywhere else. So Vax is vexing. Brandon has repeatedly avoided specifying whether Vax is a planet or not, but Isles of the Emberdark refers to somebody with Vaxalian heritage, and refers to the true Vaxilians as a species, a mortal species of the Cosmere. So maybe that's another word for the Amiens. Maybe it's a brand new species we haven't seen before. Maybe it's a brand new subspecies of humans that have been altered like the Koloss were. Who knows? I want to find out, personally. But evidently there's some form of investiture there, or there wouldn't be a need for initiation. And if there's investiture, there's likely a shard presence. Now, Bejendal is mentioned in passing in the Lost Metal by members of the Ghost Blood World Hopping group, saying, hey, travel to Benjal has been disrupted. That's 4 major systems we can't safely travel to now if we count Roshar. That's a reference to the events at the end of Wind and Truth. Roshar becomes very dangerous to travel to and from, almost impossible to do so, as of the beginning of Mistborn Era 2 / end of Wind and Truth. Cell is incredibly dangerous to go to and from. It's possible, but Brandon has said there's basically only one group that can do it safely, and if you don't get their help, you're highly likely to die. Benjal is now difficult to get to. Taldane, which is Autonomy's primary world, she's locked down access to it according to the Taldane system essay in the Arcanum Unbounded, unless she's sending invaders out. But generally speaking, if she doesn't give you permission, you ain't getting to or from. Now, Daughtry is mentioned in the Lost Metal and Isles of the Emberdark. We see characters from that planet in both of those novels. And this is likely going to be the site of the Aether novels that Brandon has been talking about writing for some time. He had written a novel called The Aether of Night, but a lot of the concepts and individuals and storylines from those he had recycled into other stories or rewritten for other stories. But he still wants to do a series based on the homeworld of the Aethers, the origin of the Aethers, and this is definitely an intriguing place. Uh, the character of Twin Soul in Lost Metal makes reference to the 12 kingdoms, indicating he is a Raj of one of these kingdoms. Raj is a title uh, in Earth, in our world, that is to say, not the Cosmere, because Cosmere has nothing to do with Earth, but in Earth's history, a Raj was a prince or king that ruled over an area of India. So there's an indication that the Datri world is heavily inspired by India and the Indian subcontinent of Earth's Asia, just as the Rose Empire and, in particular, the soul forgery of that empire were heavily influenced and inspired by Korea, and as the nations of Roshar were heavily inspired by Polynesians. Well, at any rate, uh, according to Twin Soul, and according to our Aether-bound character in Isles of the Emberdark, the Aethers, the 12 prime Aethers from which all other Aether-bound draw their power, they're older than Adonalsium. Now, again, in Lost Metal, Shai, who is from Cell, argues back. The Aethers are older than the Shattering, not necessarily older than Adonalsium, but the human servants of the Aethers seem to certainly believe that the Aethers are independent of the Shards and Adonalsium. We'll see how independent they are in later books or novels and reveals. I have a personal theory. We have two Shards that are missing or that are very difficult to contact. I would think it likely that one of those two might be in partnership with the Prime Aethers, but who knows? That's a personal theory there. But we'll be hopefully finding out more about them later. Now, the Grand Apparatus is mentioned in Isles of the Emberdark. There is a Lonarch. A Lonarch is effectively a human that has evolved to have feathers instead of hair. A Lonarch character in the Isle of the Emberdark comes from this planet, and Brendan's made a passing reference to maybe working on a novel called The Grand Apparatus. And given that the Lonarch character refers to his people as Invention's children, I would speculate that Invention is, or at least at one point was, heavily invested on this world, and there is no evidence that Invention created this world, but maybe Invention decided to build on what was already there. It's a planetary megastructure. It's a constantly shifting set of moving rooms with an invested central mechanism controlling it, and you can request bathroom facilities or room with sunlight or room with food, and you and your luggage, because my guess is that there's a self-aware, invested, almost awakened central mechanism there, to use the Nalthian term, connects you to your belongings. But because of this, there's not really a sense of privately owned space. Now, it's revealed in this novel that there is a faction of Sleepless that rule this world and conduct harsh experiments on the residents. Now, I don't know if the Lonarchs are the sole species or subspecies of human or culture of human or other groups that are on this planet, but they're the only ones we have named so far. Now, Mythos was mentioned in passing in the Lost Metal by, I won't say who because of the spoilers implied there, to Harmony, suggesting Mythos as a possible, though unlikely, place to find allies should Autonomy attack Scadrial again. Now, all we know about Mythos is that Mythos is not the name the residents call it. That is the name Offworlders call it. So Mythos might be Vax. Mythos might be Obradai. Mythos might be the Grand Apparatus. Mythos might be a completely new nation or world we've never seen before. We don't know. And now we come to Yolen. Yolen is the birthplace of all humans, dragons, and Shodel. Yes, we have dragons. If you have not read Isle of the Emberdark, we have dragons prominent in that novel. We have dragons prominent in, at least making a sizable appearance, pun intended, dragons can be quite large, in Tess of the Emerald Sea. But dragons, Shodel, and human are all native to Yolen. all the other humans of the Cosmere are either descended from people who fled Yolen or were created, as in the case of Scadrians, using Yolish humans as a model. Now, we will see Yolen in the prologue of Isles of the Emberdark very briefly, and we will see a series known as the Dragonsteel series. Now, the Dragonsteel series at present is speculated to be a planned trilogy that will be written after the 10th Stormlight book is finished, but before the last Mistborn series. That last Mistborn series is supposed to be the culmination, the end of the big overarching behind-the-scenes stories of the Cosmere. And Dragonsteel would be effectively the story of the beginnings, the prequel to all of it. Dragonsteel is the story of the shattering of the first 16 vessels and their friends Frost the Dragon and Hoid. Now, all 16 of the original vessels came from Yolen. They destroy Adonalsium, or so they believe, kill Adonalsium, shatter the power, and take it for their own. Hoid and Frost refuse to take a shard, but they're still around. Thousands of years later. Dragons, long lifespan. Hoid's weird. But this world had a lot of investiture prior to the shattering. Hoid makes use of a Yolish form of light weaving, of illusion casting, during the course of Warbreaker, when he's telling his story with sand and with powders. We also see him use this type of light weaving in the Stormlight Archives when he's telling stories that almost seem to make smoke and mist shape into things so that the listener can see what he's saying. The Ars Arcanum also mentions in, I believe it was Rhythm of War, when they talk about stone shaping, the Surge of Cohesion, that there was a form of investiture art called microkinesis on Yolen, which could be used to literally see, move, and mess with subatomic particles. That's terrifying. Now, again, the three big species are humans, dragons, and Shodel. The Shodel and the dragons are referred to as Fane life. That's a separate ecosystem in biology from the humans. The Fane life are known for having more than just 4 limbs. Now, the dragons are unique because while they are Fane life, they are born in a 4-limbed human form and can shapeshift back and forth between their natural dragon form and their human form at will once they reach their majority and have their first change. But again, more on them a little bit later. But Yolen, because it's the original homeworld, it's the standard. It's the standard for a planet's size, the length of a planet's year, the strength of a planet's gravity, the type of plant life on a planet. At least the non-Fane portions of Yolen are the standard. And that's our not quite so rapid overview of the named planets of the Cosmere. There might be more. Who knows? Brandon's immensely creative and he loves making new worlds. But so far, these are the ones we know of. Next time on Cosmere 101, the Invested Arts. Next time, we're going to talk some magic. And I'm not sure if you can hear that outside. The maintenance folks in my apartment building are doing some weeding and cleaning around the area. But take care, everybody. See you next time.